It's easy to forget these days just how highly anticipated Spore was leading up to its release. As the mastermind behind SimCity and The Sims, any project that Will Wright was attached to was bound to attract attention, and when he took the stage at 2005's Game Developers Conference and announced that his next game would be a ridiculously ambitious title centered around evolution that would allow players to shape a species from its humble origins as a single-celled organism all the way up through its emergence as a spacefaring society, looking to take its place among the stars, that attention only amplified. Over the next 3 years, Spore became a favorite of the gaming media as articles were frequently posted detailing how its implementation of player-created and procedurally generated content was set to be a complete game changer. Hell, EA was so confident of its success that one executive went so far as to predict that it would have the kind of staying power to rival The Sims. But that's not exactly what happened. Instead, perhaps inevitably, when Spore finally released in September of 2008, it failed to live up to most of its lofty expectations. While it received good reviews from critics who were won over by its scope, technical achievements, and charm, good simply wasn't good enough for a lot of players who'd been promised a revolutionary experience. Many of the planned features had been cut, and most of the ones that did survive weren't nearly as complex as players had been led to believe. This even led to Spore having the dubious distinction of being one of the few games that's been outright denounced by numerous members of the scientific community. See, during its development, Wright had expressed interest that Spore could be used as a tool in school to help explain concepts of evolution to students, and given the complete lack of AAA games with any actual educational value, many scientists were initially more than happy to give it their endorsement. However, once Spore came out and it was revealed that its take on evolution had about as much of a basis in actual science as your average episode of Doctor Who, they weren't nearly as enthusiastic. Now, personally speaking, as someone who was aware of Spore due to my interest in gaming but hadn't made it a point to closely follow along with its development, I recall being thoroughly whelmed the first time I played it over at a friend's house back in 2009. Like a lot of players, most of my memories revolve around messing with the creature creator and making all sorts of phallus-inspired abominations, and although I enjoyed it well enough to make it up to the space stage, after a few sessions I'd had my fill. And honestly, returning to Spore after all this time just makes me think that I might have originally had the ideal experience with it. Because Spore does contain some moments of true brilliance that leave an impact. There's just a true childlike joy when you put the finishing touches on one of your creations for the first time and see it come to life. I also love the way that your home planet will receive some extraterrestrial visitors during the early stages of your species, hinting at what they'll soon be capable of, and that initial reveal when you're in space and finally pull back the camera all the way for the first time and suddenly realize the true scale of Spore's galaxy is almost overwhelming. However, any return trips quickly reveal how shallow and restrictive the whole experience truly is. For those who aren't aware, the gameplay in Spore consists of 5 very distinct phases: the cell stage, the creature stage, the tribal stage, the civilization stage, and the space stage. Each of these stages are represented by different gaming genres, as Spore attempts to offer a little something for everybody. The problem though is that's obvious, all of these stages weren't given the same level of care. The space stage obviously received the bulk of the attention from Maxis and provides most of Spore's actual content. This does make a certain kind of sense considering that's the endgame and literally takes place on a galactic scale. And while extremely basic, it's obvious that Maxis was determined to make a positive first impression with the cell stage. Swimming through the primordial ooze while you munch down little leafy bits or your fellow cells in order to grow and unlock additional parts to augment your own abilities might not be all that complex, but it still provides an extremely satisfying gameplay loop, and it's easy to see why this section was spun off into a series of mobile games. But everything in between the cell stage and the space stage, yeah, that stuff's not nearly as polished. Now, in the years since its release, it's become popular for Maxis fans to blame EA for all of Spore's shortcomings, and while I understand the appeal, I don't really think it applies here. No, instead, after revisiting the game and looking into its development, the biggest issue with Spore seemed to have been a lack of clear direction and honestly, just some old-fashioned overconfidence on the part of the developers. The lack of a clear direction is best exemplified by the creature stage, where Maxis' traditional philosophy of encouraging player creation creativity and freedom is directly at odds with the game's need for the player to make actual progress. Because while you are technically free to use whichever of the parts you've unlocked during that playthrough when designing your creature, the truth is that a lot of features like mouths, hands, and feet have a tier system, meaning that some are objectively better than others. So despite the whole premise of Spore being to evolve a species as you see fit, the creature stage is constantly nudging you to use specific parts or slap on a bunch of cosmetic items you might have no interest in just to buff your stats. Hell, if you're playing as a peaceful little pacifist, then it's absolutely mandatory, as winning over new friends is impossible if your song and dance skills aren't up to task. Now, thanks to Spore's questionable take on evolution, you can haphazardly throw on all the parts you need and then just reshape your creature to your exact liking before you advance to the tribal stage, but that's not exactly the most elegant solution. And when it comes to overconfidence from Maxis, here are some passages from A Brief History of Spore, which was written by one of the game's developers. Starting with a single cell, players are responsible for guiding an individual through its life. We found that players have no trouble emotionally investing themselves into the situation, even if they don't immediately and intellectually grasp that their self, the creature that they play, is a new individual each generation. As the game progresses, the player's identity expands from individuals to tribes and then on to civilizations. Now that's an awfully generous, and some might even say slightly pretentious way of saying that as you play through Spore, it'll switch from being a mediocre quasi-RPG to a mediocre strategy game. There's a reason most titles' gameplay loops consist of a few basic mechanics. If you're working on Mario, for instance, once you've got the running and jumping refined, that's something that will obviously have a positive effect on the whole project. Or if somebody comes up with a concept for a cool power-up that the whole team just falls in love with, then you could decide to redesign some older areas to utilize it and make it a bigger part of the overall experience. But that wasn't the case with Spore, as Maxis essentially had to make 5 smaller games and then try and Frankenstein them all together into something resembling a cohesive package. And this meant that a lot of the stuff that the part of the team who's working on the cell stage wouldn't really be of any use to the part of the team who's working on the civilization stage. And this trickles down and is felt by the player. Every time you advance to a new stage, it feels like you're hitting a giant reset button because, ironically, unlike actual evolution, nothing in Spore builds on what came before. Any mechanics that you just spent the last 30 minutes having to deal with are immediately tossed out the window, and you're suddenly forced to start over again from square one, so you never feel like you're getting out of first gear. You just go from one undercooked section to the next until you get to the space stage, which finally opens up a little bit and encourages some experimentation, but even it's not really worth the wait, as most of your time will be spent carrying out glorified fetch quests and visiting planets that can be fully explored in like 2 minutes. The whole game ultimately just feels like a giant tech demo. It's cool to mess around with for a little bit, but after a short time you realize it's all bells and whistles and there's not actually any depth. Speaking of tech demos, disappointed Spore fans often point to that initial reveal and its inclusion of an underwater section as proof of what could have been if it wasn't for EA. But as cool as the idea of the underwater section sounded, there weren't actually any notable gameplay elements shown off during the demonstration. Will's character just swam around a little bit before he transitioned to the creature stage, which, art style and slightly more complex animations aside, doesn't look all that much different from what players wound up with in the final release. Then, during the reveal of the civilization stage, Will made it perfectly clear that it was always intended to be a very simple version of Risk or Civ, so it's not like the removal of the underwater section changed the direction of the entire project. Plus, let's be honest, a lot of Will's early claims for Spore still sound incredibly ambitious in 2025. Like, yeah, of course, a procedurally generated full 3D galaxy that's so incredibly detailed and with AI so advanced that every single inhabited planet has fully mapped out and logical land and aquatic ecosystems and food chains sounds incredibly cool. But just because something sounds cool doesn't mean you can actually do it. And even if it had been technically possible, it still would have required a lot of hard work for something that ultimately would have only had an actual impact on like 10% of the overall game at most. So I have a hard time believing all that stuff didn't make the cut just because some power-tripping executive at EA put their foot down. Having to scale back internal ambitions and expectations in order to deliver a game that's actually playable isn't something that's exclusive to Spore, as many developers out there can attest to. No, Spore's biggest issue is that it seems like Will Wright and the team at Maxis weren't able to do this until it was far too late, and they'd already promised far more than they could ever hope to deliver. In my opinion, the best thing for Spore would have been if Maxis identified that creating and evolving your own creatures was the main appeal of the game and had just focused on that aspect. That's the part of Spore that everybody remembers, and it's because that's the only part of Spore that offers a unique experience that you can't get anywhere else. And with the time spent making 2 bad strategy games and a mediocre space simulator, had instead been put into further developing that concept and actually building those logical ecosystems, then maybe Spore would have gone down as more than a fascinating footnote in gaming history. Instead, ironically, due to his long-standing desire to sim everything, Will Wright ultimately ended up making a game that excelled at nothing. Despite my criticisms though, I can't bring myself to hate Spore. No, it's not close to being a great game, I don't even really think it's a good game, but it is an interesting game, and the video game industry as a whole is in a much better place when people like Will Wright are out there making interesting games. Sure, every passion project won't always hit the mark, but evolution isn't exclusive to biology, and I'm sure there's more than a few talented developers, animators, and artists out there who were first inspired by Spore. Hey everybody, Dusty here. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you didn't, then I have no clue why you'd still be hanging around by this point, but whatever, you do you. If you did enjoy it though, then why not leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. That way you can be kept up to date with all my latest content. Or don't let me tell you how to live your life. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching. I'm out.